Nerede kaldı Gündoğdu?
Gelir birazdan ana.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
Hello everyone. Today we will be making an ancient Turkish meal as the Turkic people would have had it in the 1200s. This particular meal is inspired by the hit show Resurrection Ertugrul. Here, I will only be using ingredients that they would have had at the time, which means no tomatoes, potatoes, corn, or anything else from the New World. Turkic people were nomads for centuries, which meant that they primarily consumed livestock, dairy, and flatbreads. Most of their spices would have been from trade. You will see that for this particular recipe I am using lamb. I start by taking the lamb shakes and trimming the fat off of them. This is technically optional, however, I did not want to cook this for hours. The more fat that is on the lamb, the longer you need to cook it so it is soft and tender. So what I did here was shave off all the thick fat parts. You need to be careful about this. I don't have the best knife skills, but I get the job done. It's alright if there's a little bit left, you just want to get the huge clumps off. This will make it easier in the long run. Next, I will be chopping my onion. This is going to be a rough chop since it's mostly to flavor the lamb and the broth that comes in it, so don't be too worried about the shape or the size of the chunks. Next up, we have our garlic. I'm using 3 cloves here, but you can use as many or as little as you would like. The ancient Turks largely foraged for garlic, onions, and green onions as it grew around the plains that they used to migrate to. I would recommend keeping the garlic in large clumps like these because these are also to flavor the broth. If you mince them too little, they will burn in the pot. Next, we will be seasoning our lamb rather generously. Here I have black pepper, salt, and dried rosemary. The rosemary would have been foraged. The black pepper and salt would have been traded from by nearby cities. The lamb has a rather gamey taste, so I would recommend seasoning generously like this to help with the flavor in the long run. Now, just like we did with the garlic, you want to rough chop your green onions or they will burn in the pot. This is purely for aromatics and flavor purposes. Put a generous glug of olive oil in the bottom of your pot. Swirl your pot to coat the bottom evenly. You want your heat to be at a medium or medium-high at this point. You can hover your hand over the pot to feel the heat. When it is ready, put your lamb in. You want to hear a sizzle. Throw your onions in as well begin their cooking process. Next, you will carefully rotate the lamb. You want every side of it to be browned. The purpose of this browning is to create a sort of seal around the meat. This will help during the stewing process so the insides are nice and tender. Make sure you get the sides as well. Next, we throw in our garlic, and then our green onions. Next, I am using boxed beef broth, but any sort of flavored broth would do as well. Cover the pot and reduce the heat to medium or medium-low and cook to 40 minutes to an hour. Now we will be making a staple of Turkic cuisine. The recipe I'm making here is inspired by Musa Dağ Deviren's tırnak ekmek recipe. You can find it in his cookbook, the Turkish Cookbook. I did change it a little bit to suit my needs, which made it a cross between his recipe and then the classic Turkish flatbread pide. I started off here with around 2 cups of all-purpose flour. There is also half a teaspoon of salt, 1 teaspoon of sugar, and around 50 grams of yeast in this. Now we pour in 3/4 of a cup of water. And we begin the mixing process. It is important to remember here that working with any dough recipe, it will vary widely depending on where you are in the world, the humidity, the temperature, the protein content of your flour. So recipes like this will need to be constantly tweaked. You'll have to test them, and you will have to figure out what works best for you. Just as an example, the original recipe that I was working with turned out way too hard, and it did not bend or was not soft as I wanted it to be. So I had to change it to add more yeast. I kneaded it longer, and I had it proof for longer. So it just goes to show that it really depends on what type of materials you're working with and where. You want to knead the dough for 10 to 15 minutes until it forms a cohesive dough ball. Next, you're going to pour some oil into a bowl. Spread the oil around. This is so the dough does not stick to the bowl while it rises. Put the dough in and cover with cling film, followed by a dry and clean towel. Next, put it aside to rise for 30 to 40 minutes. Next, we will be making another absolute essential of Turkic cuisine, and that is rice. Unlike in most Western cultures, rice is not a side dish in Turkic cuisine, but it is often the main meal. Make sure you rinse your rice thoroughly and drain it and leave it to dry. Next, start melting a generous pat of butter in a saucepan. If it is unsalted, make sure you add a pinch of salt, but I use salted butter here. Throw in your washed and dried rice. Next, you're going to want to stir your rice continuously so it does not burn. You're going to want to toast the rice for a few minutes or until the rice starts to change color and emit a pleasant toasted smell. This is going to vastly enhance our rice's flavor and give it a nice, rich, buttery taste. Next, you're going to add some chicken broth. This is also going to add to the richness of the rice. There are no measurements in this recipe, it really is up to you. But to make sure you get the proportions correct, I recommend using the finger test. which means that you put your finger in and it should come to your first knuckle. Throw in a hefty amount of chickpeas. This is a classic method of making Turkish rice. Bring your pot to a boil, then reduce the heat, cover and simmer for 10 to 15 minutes. Make sure you keep an eye on it and add water a tablespoon at a time if needed. We bring our dough back out. You're going to want to uncover your dough. Here I'm using my finger to test its texture. You're going to know when it's the right texture over time, and it really depends on how you want your end product to be. Make sure you sprinkle a generous amount of flour on your work surface. Remove your dough from the bowl and begin your shaping process. Now this is a flatbread, so we're going to be flattening it out into a disc. Try and keep it relatively round, but this is home cooking, so don't be too worried about it. Now you're going to recover your dough and leave it to rest for 15 to 20 minutes before we give it its final shape. Whenever you are resting or letting your dough rise, make sure it is a warm environment. Uncover your dough once more. It should have risen a little bit, but not too much. Here I have an egg and milk mixture. This gives it a nice color. Mix it up and pour a generous amount on top of your dough. Here I am using my fingers to give it a traditional shape. You want it to have ridges all around and a crisscross thatch shape in the middle. These are toasted black sesame seeds and the normal white sesame seeds. This is a traditional topping for this type of flatbread. I highly recommend trying it. Here we have the final product before it goes into the oven. You're going to want to flour your pan so it does not stick while baking. Next, you're going to carefully slide on your dough and put it in the oven for 15 to 20 minutes, but make sure you start checking on it after 10 minutes. You want it to be lightly browned but not too dark. And finally, our ancient feast inspired by Ertugrul is finished. We have our flatbread, our hearty rice, and our wonderful tender lamb. Now I'm sure you've noticed that almost none of these recipes had exact measurements, and that's for a reason. Turkic culture is largely based off of oral tradition, which means the recipes would be passed on from what your mother taught you and what her mother taught her. And although this may be frustrating for beginner cooks, this also means that you have the liberty to tweak the recipes as you wish and make them a way that you like them. Thank you so much for watching, and if you have any questions or would like to start a discussion, please leave it in the comments section below. Thank you, and afiyet olsun.
Geçti mi? Geçti, iyi olacaksın.
Müsaade var mı?
Buyur beyim. Bundan sonrası takdiri ilahi. Müsaadenle.